morning. Let's try that again. Good morning.
Good morning.
Yeah. So thank you, Andy, for putting on this conference and inviting me out here. And thank you, Jesse, for teaching me how to tie my shoes like an adult. And I mean that genuinely. Jesse also told me that if I don't button this top button, I will look like a fat man. So I'm buttoning the top button for this talk. So I'm going to talk today about nourishing habits in design. I'm going to be talking about Bible salesmen a little bit, and I will also be talking about, of course, LSD. But first, I want to give you an anecdote about this trip I took to Tibet about 4 years ago. And the thing you have to understand about Tibet, this is Tibet, the thing you have to understand about Tibet is that when you fly into Tibet and you land at the airport, you're arriving at 12,000 feet. And so when you get off the plane, almost immediately you start to exhibit symptoms of altitude sickness, which include headaches, nausea, dizziness, and death. And it makes it very hard to move through the city, and particularly hard to walk upstairs. So when we checked into our hotel, I was with my traveling companion. We checked into the Yak Hotel in downtown Lhasa, and we decided to have breakfast because it was early morning and it was quite beautiful out. They have breakfast on the roof, and there are no elevators, which is kind of a cruel trick to play on people who are suffering from altitude sickness. But we managed to climb the stairs, and we got to the roof, and we were greeted with this truly breathtaking scene here. This is the Potala Palace off in the distance, and the rest of Lhasa kind of in the foreground there. And we had breakfast up on this roof together, and it was like the sun was still rising, and it was quite romantic and quite beautiful. And we decided to read some books while we were there. Why not? We're out on this roof. Sounds like a good enough place to read as any. So I pull out my book, and I had brought with me Camus' The Stranger. I'd read it many times, but I thought, well, it would be nice to bring on this trip as well. And I had just met this person actually a few weeks earlier, and this is very much an impulse adventure. And so we hadn't coordinated anything, and she takes out her book, and she also brought Camus' The Stranger by pure chance. And so, of course, you read into that, these layers of romanticism and sort of nostalgia, and you want to find meaning in that two people of bringing the same book on this trip without consultation, without really even knowing one another. I mean, the physical book for us kind of defines who we are, even if we don't read the books. I mean, how many of us just buy books and put them on our shelves, and they just make us feel guilty for not reading them? But they define who we kind of want to be as people. And what I like to do is I like to replay this moment on this roof in this hotel in Lhasa. But instead of books, we pull out Kindles. I pull out my Kindle, she pulls out her Kindle, and suddenly all of the romanticism of that moment is gone. And so what defines that experience of the physical book here in this instance? I think it's two things in particular. One is this idea of scarcity, and the other is physics. And what I mean by scarcity is simply that you cannot purchase all of the physical books in the world. So you're choosing some subset to define yourself. And then by physics, I mean you can't carry with you all of the books that you own to Tibet, right? And so there's this sort of winnowing down of what you could possibly bring here, and it creates this intensely romantic moment of serendipity, right? And that's kind of what we feel, I think, often with printed media, is like these serendipitous moments that can only happen with physical objects. And what we're really talking about here is barriers. We're talking about boundaries being placed around what's possible. And we're also talking about scaffolding. The thing I think humans are particularly good at when it comes to emotional experiences is that we're great at taking emotion and sort of applying it to physicality. And the classic example is just simply a city. We all carry within ourselves a mental map of experiences that we have within the cities that we live. And so there may be a certain corner where you had a certain kiss with your future wife or what have you. And every time you pass that corner now, you remember that, and it evokes that emotion and kind of brings that nostalgia back. And the same thing happens with physical media, and I think with physical books. In physical books, the boundaries are well defined, right? And they're easy to grasp. It's something that's grokkable. And so as we travel, both literally, if you're traveling through India, you may get curry on your physical book. And when you go back to that book, 5 years later, you find that curry and you kind of remember that cafe you were in when you ate that curry and read that book. But also figuratively as well. I mean, the book is traveling with us as we travel. These sort of journeys are happening in parallel. And I think a lot of that gets lost in digital, right? And I think this is kind of the problem a lot of folks have in this transition. And so a lot of people ask, where's the book going, And I think the first place we have to look is actually 1967. In 1967, this is when the master prognosticator of sort of all media was at his celebrity height. And of course, I'm talking about Marshall McLuhan. Scott McCloud referenced him last night. Wilson's going to reference him in the next talk. And he has this great quote, which I think sums up kind of where books are now and where they have been going for the last 35 years. And that's, the book is no longer a package, it's information service. Right? And he's explicitly talking about boundaries here. He's particularly talking about the age of Xerox. And so in the late 60s, there's a sense of like being able to photocopy things and also microfilm in particular. And he said that if you had a table big enough, you could fit all of the books in the world on that table, open to every page. And so it's no longer this linear thing. It's no longer this thing bound by any physicality. Everything is kind of, all these books are compressing into a single point that you can access at random. And that's kind of curious because if you look at microfilm, if you look at kind of the history of microfilm, it actually brings you back to 1896. There was a Canadian engineer by the name of Fessenden. And he said, first of all, he had this obsession with photography, and particularly microphotography. And he said, this is great to hear this in 1896. He said, we'll have the ability to put 150 million words in a square inch and 1.5 million volumes in a 1-foot cube. Right? And I love this because this is a guy in the 1800s talking about books and where books could be going, but it really sounds like hard drives, right? It sounds like how we talk about the iPod, 1,000 songs in your pocket. And if you want to look at, for the first manifestation of these sort of McLuhanisms and also this engineer's image of what was going to be potential with microphotography, it brings you to 1972. Does anyone know what this object is? Just a couple of you. So this is actually called the Dynabook. And it was thought of by Alan Kay. And he actually sketched it out in 1968. And this was in response to the fact that in the Army, tank repair manuals were so big that they couldn't get them into the field in an easy way. So he started thinking about what would an electronic tank manual look like. And this is what he came up with. He came up with this very curious device. And this photo was taken in 1972, and this is actually a cardboard prototype because we didn't have the technology to produce what he was thinking of. And so it's really curious when you go to 2007 now, and this guy pops out, because this guy looks awfully lot like this guy, which was 35 years earlier. And I think that for folks that are involved with design, when the Kindle came out, it almost felt like a time-shifted design, like something that came from the past. It felt like someone had gone in a time machine to 1972, asked Alan Kay, what should we build, and came back to 2007 and then made it. I think for those of us with a nostalgia and romanticism for that late 60s, early 70s period of computing in which all sorts of advancements were happening, and yet computing still hadn't kind of even entered the sphere of public knowledge yet. And people were doing LSD, and this was all happening in Palo Alto and Menlo Park and Mountain View area. It was happening in the Xerox PARC research labs. It was happening in the Stanford AI lab. And that was this period where computing was being defined. And I think, there's something romantic about that. But then finding this image and looking at the Kindle, you realize that actually right now with digital books, we're in the same space. We are almost literally back in 1972. And so we're in this period where we get to define how these are going to manifest in our lives, which I think is very exciting. I think this photo kind of sums up a lot of where we are. This photo is from an article, again, 1972, written by Stuart Brand, who was the editor of the Whole Earth catalog for several years. And he's writing an article for Rolling Stone here. And this article for Rolling Stone is called Space Wars. And it was about the Stanford AI lab and the research and the work they were doing there. And this article is kind of the first real popular manifestation in journalism for a popular audience about what was happening in this computing world. And I love the caption. It says, Bruce Baumgart, winner of the 5-man Space War Olympics, brandishing control buttons in triumph. Right? And we don't even have a vernacular yet for what he's doing or what these folks are doing. Brandishing control buttons. I love that. We don't have a language. We're still defining the language here. And so I think we're still defining a language now with ebooks and iPads and digital media and on digital tablet platforms. But the most poetic evocation of where books were going and where books are right now and where actually information is right now happened in 1975. And it appeared in a short story by Borges called The Book of Sand. And the Book of Sand begins, the line consists of an infinite number of points, the plane an infinite number of lines, the volume an infinite number of planes, and the hypervolume an infinite number of volumes. And I think this is a very key word, this idea of the hypervolume. And the story goes something like, the protagonist is at home in his apartment in Argentina, and a Bible salesman shows up at the door. And the protagonist happens to be a Bible collector, so of course, one lets a Bible salesman in when one collects Bibles. And the Bible salesman says, I think I have a volume that you will find particularly interesting. And so they sit down, and the Bible salesman is quiet, actually, for quite a while. And then he gives him the volume. And the protagonist is flipping through, and the salesman says, now, be careful. Look at that page you're on right now, because you'll never be able to find it again. And the protagonist goes, that's silly, and he closes the book, and he opens it again. And sure enough, he flips through, and he can't find the page. And all the pages are weirdly numbered, and it's got all these weird scripts on it. And he asks, what is this? And the Bible salesman says, I'd found this book in the north of India, and I bought it from an untouchable for a few rupees, and I traded him a few Bibles. I didn't feel like I was ripping him off because he was illiterate and he didn't know what he had. But the fact of the matter is that the number of pages in this book is literally infinite. No page is the first page, no page is the last. I don't know why they're numbered in this arbitrary way, but perhaps it's to give one an understanding that the terms of an infinite series can be numbered any way whatsoever. And the protagonist is captured by this book, and of course he buys it. He gives him his entire pension and trades him a very valuable other Bible for this book. And as the protagonist keeps this book, he becomes haunted by it because he's afraid someone's going to find it. He becomes intensely paranoid. And eventually, it turns out that he says, I felt it was a nightmare thing, an obscene thing, and that it defiled and corrupted reality. I considered fire, but I feared that the burning of an infinite book might be similarly infinite and suffocate the planet in smoke. This is this beautiful image. And so what he does is he takes it to the National Library and he sort of closes his eyes in a way and kind of runs into the stacks and throws it somewhere where he hopes he'll never find it again. But this idea of the hypervolume, I think, is very evocative of where we are now on the web. I know that every time I look at my Twitter stream, I can almost hear that Bible salesman reaching over my shoulder, pointing at one of these tweets going, be careful, you'll never find that tweet again. And so what we're talking about when we talk about the hypervolume or when we talk about books is we're talking about boundaries, we're talking about edges, we're talking about this sense of curation. And a lot of what we're doing in sort of figuring out the form of the future book, which none of us know what it's going to be really, is that we're trying to tame this sense of the hypervolume. We're trying to bring order and form and boundaries to what is otherwise a boundless space. Which is why it's really interesting that hypertext is what's defining digital books as we move forward. And so talking to a group of folks like you who are deeply involved with the web and design on the web, it's actually a fantastic time to start thinking about digital books and how you can engage them. To give you some analogies, basically there's three formats to think about. There's the Mobi format, which Kindle uses, EPUB, which everyone kind of uses now, and then EPUB 3 has just been ratified. And EPUB 3 incorporates a lot of HTML5 and CSS3 and all this wonderfulness that we are so used to on the web now. But if you think about it, like designing for Mobi is like designing for links. Designing for EPUB is like Netscape 2.0. And then EPUB 3 is sort of like Chrome, which I think is at version 40 or 50 by now. And so I want to give you an example of this sort of weird boundlessness, this strange confluence that's happening between the bounded physical book and the innately boundless web. So I published this article called Post-Artifacts Books and Publishing back in June this year. And this is an article about sort of how digital is affecting the systems by which we create books, write books, the way we publish books, and the way we sort of consume books afterwards. So I thought, well, it would be neat to kind of, as an experiment, create a Kindle single also for this book. And so you can create a Kindle single out of the essay, and you put it on Amazon. And what I realized when I did this was that Amazon is letting us sell web pages. This is what this is. Amazon has given us like a really simple delivery mechanism for selling a web page, because all Post Artifacts books and publishing as a Kindle single is a collection of HTML files bound by this XML index file. That's it. It's very simple. But still, almost 1,000 people paid $2.99 for the Kindle edition of this, despite the fact that the entire thing was free online, and despite the fact that you could Instapaper it and get it on your Kindle that way. So I started thinking, why are people paying money for this? And I'm sure an element of it was just to support the work that I was doing, and I'm tremendously grateful for that. But I think there's another element, and that's putting it out as a Kindle single creates a sense, again, of boundaries, edges, and curation happening around this object, around this text. And when it lives on a web page in a browser, it feels like it's part of that boundless space, and you can never truly own it. But when you put it on Amazon, and even though any of you could publish a Kindle single, there's still this kind of sense built into us that being on Amazon is somehow being in a special space. And so I think it feels like it's been curated. I mean, this is why we read the New York Times, at least why I read the New York Times more regularly than, say, Google News, because the New York Times, I know, has been curated by a group of folks I trust. And so this sense of curation is tremendously powerful. If we're talking about Kindle books, we have to talk about this one, which just came out a couple weeks ago. How many of you are reading the Steve Jobs biography right now? Or have read it? Great, it's like almost all of us. And the thing that I think is really wonderful about this book is that it feels like the first real book happening that's occurred since like my mom understood what a Kindle was. You know, it's the first major book that's kind of transcended tech and design and liberal arts, and a lot of folks are reading it simultaneously. We've all kind of jumped in at the same time. And so it brings up a couple of questions. Like, shouldn't it be really easy to know who in this room is reading this right now? Like, shouldn't I be able to open the Kindle and kind of look at my Steve Jobs book and click on something and be able to see who in my proximity is reading this and how far along you are? I mean, to sort of, catalyze conversations. I go into my office every morning at Flipboard, and we always say, well, how far are you? What percentage are you in the book? And it seems weird that these things aren't being surfaced yet. I think this is one of our jobs as designers, designing the future book, is to find nourishing ways to surface these things. Second insight that came out of this is that there's a shifting of acceptance happening. A lot of folks who normally would have bought the hardcover edition bought the Kindle edition. I was asking them why, and it was because they felt like highlighting in a physical book is now this like really anachronistic act where you highlight and then it's dead, you can't do anything with it. But with a Kindle, once you get addicted to Kindle highlighting and Kindle note-taking, it's wonderful because they all live there on the web and you can kind of reference it at any point you need to. And then finally, waiting for the hardcover to be released before releasing the Kindle edition just feels weird, right? Seth Godin a couple weeks ago wrote a little email post saying that there's going to be this, predicting this movement of kind of pre-ordering or pre-selling to people who are really devoted. I know I would have paid $40 to have gotten the Kindle edition a week early. I know a lot of other people would have too. And the reason they don't release it early is because they don't want to cannibalize hardcover sales. And that's also the reason why they price the Kindle edition almost exactly the same price as the hardcover, because a lot of the book industry revolves around what happens with the hardcover edition, and it hasn't yet caught up to revolve around what happens with, say, the digital edition. And there's this procession with this book. For example, when you buy the Steve Jobs biography, this is your Kindle kind of reading list, and then it pops in there, it just appears, and then you're kind of thrown into this screen. There's no ceremony whatsoever. You're thrown into the icy waters of Walter Isaacson's prose. And then to get back to this, to get to the cover, you have to hit back 28 times, which is a weird thing. I mean, I would posit that 99.999% of all Kindle users have never seen this cover. And it's a shame because it's almost like they're ashamed of illustrations on the Kindle because actually e-ink is this beautifully evocative display technology. And if you look at this cover, it's quite beautiful on the Kindle. In fact, it's maybe in some ways more beautiful than the printed edition. And it also ties back great to like 1972 with Alan Kay because it's like, this is the display technology that feels like it's from 1972, but wasn't possible until like the early 2000s. And it's getting better and better. But what this really points to, this kind of having to go back 28 times to get to the cover, is this generalized marginalization of the cover that's happening in digital books. And this happened also in other medias as well. But it's interesting to kind of point out some concrete examples. You go to Amazon.com, and now finding where the books actually live on Amazon.com is quite a task. And when you finally do find where books are on Amazon, you go in there and you look at sort of the top 100 list. And already, the covers being fairly marginalized in this space, you'd think that they would want to bring the cover up and sort of, have it be front and center to kind of pull users in, but they don't. And in fact, none of these covers really convey any information. I mean, the iWaz cover kind of does a little bit, but the rest are effectively unreadable. And then when you tap in, you're on this page that's so complex that the cover is all but lost. And this cover was clearly designed for print, and it just simply doesn't work here in this context. And then this cover, though, however, works very well. Steve Jobs is not only an icon, but this cover has become an icon. And this is kind of where we have to think of covers moving forward. In the 90s and the knots, covers were these things that when you walked into Barnes & Noble, they were to capture your attention, they were to fight with each other and sort of grab you, they were to be as loud as possible. There were these marketing mechanisms. And now marketing doesn't happen when you walk into Borders because Borders doesn't exist anymore. Marketing happens now through social media, right? People point at things that you respect, and they say, hey, this thing over here is really great, check it out. And when you land on this page after someone pointed at it, that cover really isn't going to influence whether or not you buy or don't buy. It's just there to ground you and sort of allow you to know, well, I'm at the right page. Because really what you look at is you look at how many stars has it gotten, how many ratings has it gotten, how many comments are there, and how much cheaper is it to buy it here than somewhere else. And if we look at covers in other contexts, this is an app called Open Margin. And it came out just a couple weeks ago. Already you can see that the cover is being encroached upon by sort of social actions. These indicators of who amongst your friends are reading. The cover is no longer this thing that sits on its own, but it's competing with other metadata. You look at the iBooks bookstore. There's almost no cover in here that makes sense in this context. Steve is the only thing that pops out. This is my Kindle archive, and even in here you can see some covers work better than others. Gray 318, who's a brilliant cover designer's work for Jonathan Safran Foer is particularly powerful here. It stands out. Again, Seth Godin with his Domino Press, the one decision they made about design that is wonderful, I think, is that their covers here, the child with the head sticking out and this man sort of doing work down here, labor down here, these are iconographic. They were built for basically resolution independence. In some ways, we have to start thinking about covers in these different contexts. We have to design almost different covers for these different contexts. Carden Webb did a beautiful series of covers for Oliver Sacks, and you can imagine, this is for a printed edition, but you can imagine how well it would work sorted by author in this context as well. And so it's interesting to see these kind of plays between what we're doing in print and what we should be doing in digital. And I want to contrast this now, this procession that we experience with the Kindle edition of Steve Jobs' biography, of going straight into the intro text where you don't even know if it's the beginning or not. You don't know if you've accidentally opened to the wrong spot. And then you have to go back to get to this cover. I want to contrast it with this book called The Conference of the Birds. And this was written, designed and written by this extremely brilliant designer, Farah Ben Adi. It was published by Thames and Hudson in 2009. And it's this beautiful deconstruction of this classic Arabic poem. And so when you open your Amazon box, this is what you see. You get this. And then when you take it out of the slipcase, you get this. And then when you open it, you get these end pages. And then the first opening spread is this, and you begin to get a sense of how beautiful the paper is, how wonderful the printing is, how much attention to all of the details have been played by Farah. You start to get to these die cuts that appear before you get into the text. It's setting a tone, it's setting a rhythm. It's this really beautiful evocation of what's to come in the book. It doesn't just throw you into calligraphy. And you can tell every spread has been given a lot of love. There's a beautiful use of white space. There's a beautiful use of color. Everything in this book has been well considered. And that experience, that procession through all of these pieces feels well considered. It feels beautiful. And so it begs the question of, should digital books have a procession? Does this kind of procession even make sense in the digital context? What should that procession look like if we do produce a procession? And then finally, should we mimic media-specific conventions? Because the reason why that book has the pieces it has, the reason why a physical book has a cover is to keep that middle bit protected, right? And the reason why you have beautiful end pages is to glue that middle bit to the cover. And the reason why we kind of have these opening spreads is because we didn't used to put covers on these text blocks. And we had to put some cheap paper on there and do a half title on top of that. So all of the design of a book kind of comes from these historical, functional precedents, right? And so when we take these and sort of thoughtlessly dump them into digital contexts, it's really disingenuous, right? And so what are those digital processions that we should start to evoke or think about evoking? And so why is this beautiful? It's beautiful because obviously it's just because it's beautiful in and of itself, but there's also an awareness of the container, an awareness of content going on here in the design. None of this design subverts the user experience of this book, which is a silly thing to say. But when Gutenberg established the platform of movable type and printing, he was establishing sort of a rhetoric around which all books were going to work. And this abides by that. It doesn't subvert it in any way. And so when you give this book to a reader, they know exactly how to use it, and the design plays within those constraints. And Charles Eames has this great quote, famous quote, "Design depends largely on constraints," and I'd modify it to say great design depends totally on constraints in a lot of ways. And the physical book is all constraints, and we get it. Paper is easy now. We have hundreds of years of history designing for this and using this object. This we understand. When you hand it to somebody, you just say, they ask, how do you use this? If you've never given them a book before, you just say, just keep swiping. That's how you use a book. It's a beautifully simple interaction model. And so physical book design and usability are defined on this base level by that object's physicality, right? And this definition creates extremely predictable usability and interaction expectations on the part of the users. And so beautiful content emerges from, I say, predictable containers, predictable interfaces, and predictable usability, right? And in other words, don't misconstrue delight and novelty. At Flipboard, we talk about long-term wows and short-term wows. And when we say short-term wow, we talk about the thing that maybe the user sees once when they open an app for the first time, and it kind of blows their mind, and maybe they never see it again. But it's like this wow to capture them and draw them in. Another example of a short-term wow I think manifests over the long term, and much to its detriment, is the page flip in iBooks. This sort of skeuomorphic kind of page curling that the first time you see it, the first 5 times you see it, it's kind of cool. But really, after you read a book that's 500, 600, 1,000 pages long in there, it gets old very quickly. And so a long-term wow is more these wows that users may not see for months or maybe even years. I read Kindle books on an iPod Touch for about 2 years before I bought an actual Kindle. And when I got the Kindle, it came in the mail, I opened it, turned on the power, and all of my books, all of my notes were already there. And that's not surface design necessarily, but that's definitely a user experience design example. And that was a massive wow. And that's the sort of wow that's only evoked after many years or many months. And it's sort of the wows that a lot of folks don't even recognize. So this idea of delight versus novelty, you want to constantly delight the user with simplicity and long-term wows that maybe they don't even recognize are happening half the time, but you definitely don't want to be bogged down by novelty in your designs when we're thinking about how to evoke emotion in future books. So I want to quickly just talk about navigation, because navigation is kind of where a lot of this delight novelty construing happens. And so in the seminal Kinross Designing Books book, he says the axis of symmetry of the spine is always there when he's talking about books. No one can deny it. This is what defines book design, the spine. And so book designers are effectively always working over the spine space. And then when you get an iPad, it begs the question, where's the spine? There is no inherent physical spine. There's nothing of this object that defines an edge. And so the spine could be at the top, it could be on the side, it could be on the other side, it could be on the bottom. And what you end up with is sort of this infinite canvas, to evoke more of Scott McCloud, this infinite canvas of space, or in other words, the hypervolume in a lot of ways. Because I think once information extends beyond our ability to grok it, once information crosses this threshold of our periphery, of vision in our mind, it becomes effectively infinite. And so this, without defining boundaries, without defining spines, becomes a hypervolume, in my opinion. And so without choosing a spine, we default to this kind of dual axis navigation, which really doesn't work. It's very ungrounding. It's that sense of borderlessness that kind of upsets us, that creates anxiety in us. And so when you're in the middle of reading a text that's built off of this dual axis navigation, this is kind of where you end up. And how are you supposed to build a mental map around that? It's a very difficult thing. And so single axis navigation vastly simplifies the user experience of digital reading. And this is something that, if you look at Flipboard, we have kind of taken to the extreme. You can literally download Flipboard and swipe from right to left, and you swipe once and you're at the TOC, you swipe again, you're in the content, you can just keep swiping through content. There's no shifting of axes really implicit in that core navigation component. And so you ask which direction, and you can always just say forward. Forward may be right, might be up, might be down, might be left, but it just has to be consistent. In other words, just keep swiping, right? And something curious happened here in digital books because printed books and printed magazines are effectively the same user experience, right? You put a printed magazine, printed book on the table, they're used in the exact same way. You just keep swiping through them. But digital books and digital magazines are totally not compatible in their interfaces. It's very bizarre. Kindle and iBooks, sort of take that just keep swiping ethos, whereas digital magazines have kind of gone off into their own creative spaces. Being kind. And you end up with this user experience of what, just keep what? And so I've collected a series of help screens that you get to when you open these magazines. And this isn't to say that these are bad. I'm not saying that any of this is bad. I'm just trying to illustrate how totally inconsistent our experiences with digital text are on tablet devices. And so, some of them have these kind of cute explanation screens. Others are sort of, over the interface. Others have these layered screens of explanation where if you tap in this context, it does one thing. If you tap in another, it does another thing. If you swipe in this context, it brings up this menu. How are you supposed to remember all of this? This app, I would have turned this sideways, but it's already so small. It's a window within a window explaining through a bunch of windows what you're supposed to do in this app. And there's actually like 4 or 5 screens of this. Why do we expect as designers for users to remember any of this when we came from a medium that was totally implicit? There was no reason to break that implicit, genuine interaction model. And so Buckminster Fuller has this great quote, "I see God in the instruments and mechanisms that work reliably." And I think Fuller would have a hard time seeing God in any of our digital content design right now, because there is no reliability. When I download a new app, I don't know what to expect. And so what can be done now is sort of, I think, it's an important question. It's a curious question. A lot of people dismiss some of the platforms that currently exist in digital books. For example, iBooks. A lot of folks, designers particularly, have kind of dismissed that as something that you can't make look good, right? But what iBooks brings or what Kindle brings is a consistency, which can't be, you can't overvalue consistency. And so I tried, when I produced the ArtSpace Tokyo Kickstarter project a year ago and got funding, I said we were also going to do a digital edition. And I know that it still hasn't come out, but it's actually been done for 8 months. I've just been trying to write it up and explain why we did what we did in this edition. And I made very conscious decision not to say we were going to release an app, because I don't really believe in this necessity to keep reinventing interfaces for what are generally linear content experiences. And so we took ArtSpace Tokyo, and I worked with Ron, this wonderful designer, Ron Bilodeau over at O'Reilly, who does all of their EPUB books. And he worked with us, and he produced this beautiful EPUB edition for iBooks. And so this is what one of the spreads looks like in print, and this is what we were able to evoke in iBooks, which I don't think is that horrible. Here's another print spread, and here's what we got in iBooks. And the thing to remember, I think that's really apropos for this group of folks, is that iBooks is just WebKit. That's all it is. When you open iBooks, each of these pages is just a web browser. And this is just HTML. And actually, iBooks supports right now a little bit more of the HTML than EPUB, the standard EPUB support sort of document states. So you can kind of do things like use font face. We license fonts from Typotech to use in this book. So we're using Fedora all over this book, and we're able to do kind of neat layout things, like in these interview spaces where we have a running margin here besides the text. This is possible today in iBooks. And what's beautiful about this is that it comes with a really strong distribution method, which is obviously Apple in the iTunes store. And it also comes with predictability. Everyone who downloads this book will know exactly how to experience it. And with EPUB 3 coming, and EPUB 3 kind of embraces HTML5 and CSS3 and JavaScript, we're sort of where we were about 10 years ago on the web, where we know there's going to be cool things we can do, but we aren't quite there yet. And these standards have been ratified, and I think we've kind of learned that standards are good things. And so most folks are adopting EPUB 3. Kindle is adopting their own format, which is slightly unfortunate, but it's HTML5 based. So the ability to do beautiful typographic layouts and sort of incorporate all of these typographic nuance that's appearing in WebKit will begin to appear in digital books. So it's actually going to be quite an exciting platform, I think, and quite a fun space to start exploring it. And in other words, like this printed page kind of equals one page on the iPad in the sense of surface design. So everything we've learned about book design, how to design for a page, can totally apply to a single screen on the iPad in terms of surface, in terms of typography and use of white space. And that's why I released Bibliotype earlier this year. It's because this is kind of not something we need to spend too much time worrying about. Next year, we're going to have 300 PPI screens, and EPUB 3 is going to get better. The layouts are going to get more capable and robust. And so Bibliotype is just a way of saying, well, here, based on our previous precepts of print design, here's a set of templates. You can download it off my website, craigmod.com. Here's a set of templates that will get us started, that start to think about the screen using these core design principles that we kind of have used for a very long time now. And so we're here, right? We're at this icy stage of sort of no procession and no tone and no rhythm to the way we enter digital books. And a lot of folks are focused on how do we get here? And I think we're going to be here pretty soon, actually. Next year, by this time, we should be able to, especially with 300 PPI screens. If any of you have done design for the Retina on the iPhone 4 and iPhone 4S, the nuance you can pull out of typography in there is quite staggering and quite inspiring. It's beautiful. I personally, as a designer, cannot wait for the iPad to get to that level. And I think that we're going to create some truly breathtaking things. But a couple months ago, an interviewer asked me, why are you in Silicon Valley right now? Why are you over, if you're interested in books, why are you working for a tech company over there? And well, obviously, the future of books and future of publishing is intrinsically connected with technology. So why not be where all that technology is being developed? And again, it kind of has this nice parallelism to the 60s and 70s with Alan Kay and all their LSD, and working at the Stanford AI Lab and the Xerox PARC Lab, and having that close by. You kind of draw a certain inspiration from that of forging ahead, forcing ahead in these new fields. But really, the reason why I'm out there is that I'm trying to bring a remembrance of this moment, this emotion that happened on this rooftop in Tibet. And I think the thing that the red herring when we're doing design for electronic books is that we try to find one-to-one analogs between these physical experiences and the digital counterparts. And that this experience on the rooftop in Tibet, this could only happen because the books were physical. That scarcity and the boundaries created by physics are what made it special. And we're never going to be able to evoke that exact thing digitally, because digital by its very nature is boundless. But what we can do is we can remember that emotion. We can remember that feeling, those goosebumps, that sort of churning in the stomach that you had, when you had these experiences with physical books. Those sort of nostalgias and memories, not to get caught up on the physicality, but to think about, as we design digital books, as we design future books, where does that nostalgia live? Where does that emotion live? And I think that is the true nourishing bit as we design for the future book. Thank you.